My name is Naomi Bennett, and I'm 28 years old. The day I buried my father was the day I discovered he'd been murdered. I stood in the rain outside St. Catherine's Church in Portland, watching them load his casket into the hearse. Robert Bennett had been a self-made man, a real estate developer who'd built an empire from nothing. Now he was gone at 62, taken by what everyone believed was a sudden heart attack. And white Uncle Richard approached me as the crowd thinned, his son Tyler trailing behind with an expression I couldn't quite read. Richard had always been the struggling brother, the one Dad constantly bailed out of business failures and bad investments. But today something was different. His eyes gleamed with barely concealed satisfaction, and his grip on my shoulder was too tight. "Too possessive. We need to talk," Richard said, his voice low but commanding. "About your father's will." Nodded, assuming this would be a simple reading at Dad's attorney's office next week. I was wrong. What happened in that church parking lot over the next 10 minutes would expose a web of fraud, betrayal, and murder that reached back years. I left the church parking lot with Richard's threats still ringing in my ears and drove straight to my downtown Portland office. Not to some cramped studio apartment, not to sit around grieving helplessly. To my actual office on the 14th floor of the Morrison Building, with a brass nameplate on my door read, "Bennett and Associates, Forensic Accounting and Estate, LAWM." Why family had no idea. For 7 years, I'd let them believe I was just Dad's assistant, learning the real estate business, taking notes in meetings, organizing files. The truth was more complicated. I held a master's in forensic accounting from Georgetown and a law degree from Northwestern. I'd passed the Oregon bar 3 years ago and built a practice that specialized in exactly the kind of fraud Richard had just attempted: estate fraud, financial crimes, document forgery, the cases other attorneys wouldn't touch because they required both legal expertise and deep financial analysis. I deliberately kept my credentials hidden from everyone except Dad. Not out of shame, but out of necessity. Make your own name first, Dad had told me when I graduated. Build something that's yours. Then, when you join the family business, nobody can say you rode my coattails. I did. I built a small but elite practice that handled cases for clients across 3 states. Corporate executives who suspected embezzlement. Families who discovered forged wills after a loved one died. Widows whose inheritance mysteriously disappeared. I'd seen every variation of financial betrayal, and I'd documented every single one with the kind of precision that held up in court. And my best friend and law partner, Jasmine Rodriguez, looked up from her desk as I walked in, still wearing my funeral dress. Mascara probably streaked down my face from the rain. "How bad?" she asked. He forged a will. In the church parking lot, in front of 20 witnesses. I dropped my purse on the conference table and pulled out my phone. Richard claims Dad left everything to Tyler. Jasmine's eyes went wide. "Your Uncle Richard? The one your dad bailed out how many times?" 6. "That we know of." I scrolled through the photos I'd discreetly taken of the forged document. Business failures, gambling debts, bad investments. Dad covered at least $400,000 over the years, probably more, and now he's claiming the entire estate, $15 million, give or take. The company, all the properties, investments, everything. I enlarged the signature on my phone screen, but he got sloppy. "Look at this." Jasmine moved closer, studying the image. She'd worked fraud cases for the DA's office before we partnered up. Her eye for detail was even sharper than mine. "The signature's too clean," she said immediately. "No tremor, no variation in pressure. Dad broke his wrist in a cycling accident 12 years ago. It never healed quite right. His signature always had this distinctive wobble, especially on the downstroke of the B." I swiped to another photo. This looks like someone traced it, probably from an old document, notary seal, Multnomah County, dated March 15th. Dad was in San Diego that entire week for a real estate conference. I have his calendar, his flight receipts, hotel confirmations. He was never in Portland to sign this. Jasmine sat back, processing. So Richard forged a will, named himself executor, and announced it at your father's funeral. In front of family, friends, business associates. He wanted witnesses to the reading, wanted to establish legitimacy through public declaration. I set down my phone. Classic con move. Make it so public that questioning it seems disrespectful to the deceased, except he didn't know you're a forensic accountant who specializes in exactly this kind of fraud nobody knows. That's the problem. I looked out the window at the Portland skyline, the same view I'd worked toward for 7 years. If I reveal what I do, Richard will claim bias. Say I'm using my legal knowledge to contest a legitimate will out of greed, but if you don't reveal it, how do you fight this? I pulled up my contacts, scrolling to a name I hadn't called in 3 years. Victoria Chin, Dad's former secretary, who disappeared after money went missing from the company accounts. Her name was on that forged will as a witness. I start with the truth, I said. And I find Victoria before Richard does. If you've ever had to hide your success to protect yourself, to build something in silence because you knew the moment you succeeded openly someone would try to diminish it or take credit or use it against you, type "I understand" in the comments below. Sometimes the smartest move is staying quiet until you're ready to make noise that can't be ignored. It took me 48 hours to find Victoria Chin. 48 hours of tracing credit card transactions, utility bills, and social media footprints, so faint they barely existed. She'd been careful, but not careful enough to hide from someone who knew how to follow money trails. The address led me to a small apartment complex in Spokane, Washington, 3 hours from Portland. The building was older, modest, the kind of place where people minded their own business and didn't ask questions. I stood outside apartment 3B for a full minute before knocking, rehearsing what I'd say if she opened the door. She did. And the woman who answered looked nothing like the polished professional I remembered from Dad's office. Victoria had aged years in the 3 since she'd disappeared. Her hair, once styled and highlighted, now hung plain and dark around her shoulders. She wore no makeup, and her eyes held the kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly looking over your shoulder. Naomi. She said my name like a ghost, like she'd been expecting me, but hoped I'd never come, that I need to talk to you about my father's will. And about Richard. Her face went pale. For a moment, I thought she might close the door. Instead, she stepped aside, letting me into an apartment that was clean but sparse. Packed boxes stacked against one wall, like she was ready to run at any moment. I heard about Robert's death, she said quietly, not meeting my eyes. I'm sorry. Everyone thinks it was a heart attack. I stayed standing, watching her carefully. But you know it wasn't, don't you? Victoria's hands trembled as she wrapped them around herself. How did you find me? I'm a forensic accountant. It's what I do. I pulled out my phone, showing her the photo of the forged will. Your name is on this document as a witness. A will that leaves everything to Tyler and names Richard as executor. That's impossible. I never signed anything like that, I know. Because you disappeared 3 years ago after money went missing from Dad's company. $400,000 in accounting discrepancies. I moved closer. But you didn't steal that money, did you? You discovered someone else was stealing it. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and something broke behind her eyes. I tried to tell your father. I tried to warn him. Tell me everything. Victoria walked to her kitchen table and sat down heavily, like the weight of 3 years in hiding had finally become too much. I started noticing irregularities about 5 years ago. Small things at first. Invoices that didn't match up, contractor payments that seemed inflated, properties listed on the books that I couldn't verify existed. Phantom properties, I said. Classic embezzlement technique. I thought I was going crazy at first. Your father trusted Richard with so much, gave him access to accounts, let him handle deals. I kept finding these contracts signed by Richard for property acquisitions that never actually happened, but the money still went out. How much? $2.3 million over 5 years. The number came out flat, practiced, like she'd calculated it 1,000 times. Richard created shell companies, fake LLCs, phantom real estate deals. Money would flow out of your father's accounts into these companies, then disappear into offshore accounts I couldn't trace. M.Y. hands clenched at my sides. 2.3 million. Dad had supported Richard for years, bailed him out repeatedly, and Richard had been stealing from him the entire time. I compiled everything, Victoria continued. Every fake contract, every suspicious payment, every shell company. I put it all on a flash drive and showed it to your father when 3 years ago in August. Robert was devastated. He said he needed time to decide how to handle it, that Richard was still his brother, but he promised me he'd make it right. Her voice broke. 2 days later, Richard showed up at my apartment. Midnight. He knew where I lived, knew where my sister lived with her kids. He said if I didn't disappear, if I didn't take the fall for the missing money, something might happen to my family. He threatened your sister's children. He was calm about it. That's what scared me most. Just very calm, very matter of fact. Said it would be easy to make it look like I'd stolen the money since I'd been the one tracking it. Said no one would believe me over him anyway. Victoria stood up and walked to a closet, pulling out a shoebox. So I ran. Changed my name back to my maiden name, Lynn. Started using cash for everything. But I kept the evidence. She handed me the box. Inside was a flash drive along with copies of bank statements, contracts, and a notebook filled with handwritten documentation. Your father knew I didn't steal anything, she said. He kept investigating on his own. About 6 months ago, he called me. Said he had enough evidence to go to the authorities. Said Richard would finally face consequences. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. 1 week later, I read about Robert's sudden heart attack. And I knew what? Victoria looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. I knew Richard had killed him, because your father was going to destroy everything Richard thought he deserved. The inheritance, the reputation, the connection to the Bennett name. Robert was going to send him to prison. So Richard made sure that never happened. The flash drive felt heavy in my hand. Heavier than any evidence I'd ever held. This wasn't just fraud anymore. This was murder, and the proof was sitting in a shoebox in a rundown apartment in Spokane where a woman had been hiding for 3 years. Help me prove it, I said. Help me make sure my father gets justice. Victoria nodded slowly. I've been waiting for someone to ask. Victoria made coffee while I examined the contents of the flash drive on my laptop. 5 years of meticulous documentation. Bank transfers, shell company formations, property deeds that existed only on paper. Every transaction traced back to Richard with a precision that would hold up in any courtroom. But fraud was just the beginning. The poisoning started about 8 months ago, Victoria said, setting a mug in front of me. I didn't realize it at the time. I was in hiding, monitoring from a distance. But I kept track of Robert through mutual contacts, news articles about his company. People said he was slowing down, getting tired more easily, that he was 62. People assumed it was age, exactly what Richard counted on. She pulled out her notebook, flipping to pages filled with dates and observations. I started noticing Richard's car at your father's house at odd times. Early morning, late evening, times when Robert would be alone. I drove past a few times, just to check. I saw Richard letting himself in with a key. Dad gave Richard a house key years ago. For emergencies, Richard used it for murder. Victoria's voice was steady now, clinical. I started researching what would cause someone to have heart symptoms that seemed natural. Fatigue, irregular heartbeat, shortness of breath. Everything Robert was experiencing. Digoxin, I said quietly. She looked up surprised. You know, I'm a forensic accountant who handles estate fraud. Poisoning via heart medication is more common than people think, especially in inheritance cases. I'd seen it twice before, though both times we'd caught it before death occurred. Small doses mixed into food or drinks, builds up in the system over time, eventually causes heart failure that looks completely natural. That Richard's ex-wife had heart problems. She was prescribed digoxin before she died 5 years ago. The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. He kept her medication, or knew how to obtain more. There are forums online, overseas pharmacies that don't ask questions. Victoria slid her notebook toward me. I documented every time I saw Richard's car at the house. 17 times over 6 months. Always when Robert would be home alone that I pulled out my phone and called Dr. Nina Foster, the medical examiner who'd signed off on Dad's death certificate. We'd worked together on 3 cases involving suspicious deaths that insurance companies wanted investigated. Nina, it's Naomi Bennett. I need to ask about my father's autopsy. Naomi, I'm so sorry for your loss. But there wasn't an autopsy. The death was clearly natural causes. I need you to run a toxicology screen. Full panel, specifically checking for cardiac glycosides. There was a pause. You think your father was poisoned? I think someone wanted his death to look natural. Can you still run tests? The body's still in the morgue. We held it for a week in case the family wanted additional services. I can run a comprehensive tox screen. But Naomi, if you're right about cardiac glycosides, this becomes a homicide investigation. I know. 2 days later, Nina called me back. I was in my office with Jasmine and Victoria, the 3 of us building a case file that grew thicker by the hour. Naomi, sit down, Nina said when I answered that I'm sitting. Digoxin levels are 3 times the fatal dose. At those concentrations, death would have occurred within hours of the final dose. Your father didn't die from natural heart failure. He was murdered. The room went silent. Jasmine's hand found mine across the table. Victoria closed her eyes, vindicated and devastated all at once. The poisoning was systematic, Nina continued, her voice professional but gentle. I found accumulation patterns suggesting repeated dosing over at least 6 months. Small amounts initially, then increasing. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Can you determine when the final dose was administered? Based on digoxin concentration and liver analysis, I'd estimate between 8 and 12 hours before death. Your father died around 2 a.m. according to the initial report. So the fatal dose would have been given sometime between 2 and 6 p.m. the previous evening. I pulled up the calendar on my phone, scrolling back to the day Dad died. Friday, October 13th. I'd been in Seattle that day for a deposition, unreachable for most of the afternoon. Dad had texted me at 4 p.m. Richard stopped by. Says he has exciting business opportunity to discuss. Dinner conversation should be interesting. Richard had been there. Right in that window when the final dose would have been administered. Nina, this is now a criminal investigation. I need you to contact the Portland Police Department and report this as a homicide. I'm going to need copies of every test result, every finding, already prepared. I'll have them sent to your office and to the detective who'll be assigned. Naomi, I'm sorry. I should have been more thorough initially. You had no reason to suspect. That's what made Richard's plan so effective. After I hung up, I looked at Victoria and Jasmine. 3 women sitting in an office with evidence that would destroy a man who thought he'd gotten away with murder. I pulled out my father's favorite photo from my wallet. The 2 of us at a construction site 7 years ago, both wearing hard hats, Dad's arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling at some joke I couldn't remember now. He'd been teaching me about foundation work that day. How the most important part of any building is what you can't see. The structure that holds everything else up. You taught me well, Dad, I whispered to the photo. You taught me to build cases that can't be torn down. Damn, why grief had been living in my chest like a weight since the funeral. Now it transformed into something colder, sharper. Determination with edges sharp enough to cut. Richard had taken my father, had stolen years of his life, his trust, and finally his breath. But he'd made one fatal mistake. He'd underestimated me. Tyler called me 3 days after the funeral. His number appeared on my phone at 11 p.m., and I almost didn't answer. But something in my gut told me to pick up, that we need to talk. His voice shook. I didn't know Naomi. I swear I didn't know that we met the next morning at a coffee shop in northeast Portland, neutral territory where neither of us had history. Tyler arrived early, sitting in the back corner, his usually neat appearance disheveled. He'd always been the quiet cousin, the one who hung back at family gatherings, never quite fitting in with either the successful or the struggling branches of the family tree. He looked up when I approached, and I saw genuine fear in his eyes. "I never wanted Uncle Robert's company," he said before I could even sit down. "I never wanted any of this." I set down my coffee carefully. "Then why did you stand there silent when your father announced a will that left you everything?" "Because I thought it was real." He pulled out his phone, hands trembling slightly. 6 months ago, Dad started telling me that Uncle Robert had noticed me, that he was impressed with how I'd turned my life around after dropping out of college. Said Robert wanted me to learn the business, and why Father never mentioned you in business context that I know that now. But I was desperate to believe it. Tyler scrolled through his text messages, turning the phone so I could see. "Look at what Dad was sending me." The messages dated back to April. "Robert's finally recognizing your worth. Keep working hard. The business will be yours soon. Don't tell Naomi yet. He wants it to be a surprise." Message after message, building a narrative where Tyler was the chosen heir. "He told me Uncle Robert regretted not having a son," Tyler continued. "Said he saw me as the son he never had, that he wanted to train me to take over when he retired. I met him for lunch twice, and he was kind to me, asked about my life. I thought it was real. You met with my father in September and October. Dad arranged them. We talked about real estate market trends, development opportunities in the Pearl District. Your father was encouraging, said he was glad I was taking an interest." Tyler's voice cracked. "I thought I'd finally done something, right? That I pulled the photos of the forged will up on my phone. Did you ever see this document before the funeral?" "Never. Dad just told me everything was arranged, that I needed to trust him." He looked at the signature, then at me. "That's not really Uncle Robert's signature, is it?" "No." Tyler put his head in his hands. "He used me. All those texts, those lunches he set up, making me think I mattered to someone in this family for once. It was all manipulation to make the forged will seem legitimate. To have a beneficiary who'd believe it was real. Did your father ever mention Victoria Chin, the secretary who stole money?" "Dad said she betrayed Uncle Robert's trust, that she disappeared before anyone could prosecute her. She didn't steal anything. She discovered your father was embezzling millions from my dad's company. Richard threatened her family to make her run." Tyler's face went white. "No, he wouldn't. He's my father. Your father forged a will, stole over $2 million, and murdered my dad to cover it up." I kept my voice level, clinical. The toxicology report came back. Dad was poisoned with digoxin over 6 months. He died of deliberate cardiac failure, murdered. Tyler said the word like he was testing it, like he couldn't quite believe it applied to his father. "He killed Uncle Robert. Yes, I need to help you." Tyler stood up abruptly, then sat back down. "I need to help you prove it. He used me, made me part of this. I thought my own father finally believed in me, and it was all a lie to commit murdered. If you testify, you'll be implicating your own father. He stopped being my father the moment he killed yours." Tyler met my eyes, and I saw something I hadn't expected. Resolve. "What do you need from me?" 2 weeks after the funeral, I sat in my office with evidence spread across every available surface. Jasmine had printed everything, organized it into color-coded folders that would make any prosecutor weep with joy. Victoria's financial documentation, the forged will analysis, toxicology reports, Tyler's text messages, pharmacy records showing Richard obtaining digoxin using his ex-wife's old prescription information. Every piece pointed to the same conclusion. Richard Bennett had systematically murdered his brother. "The timeline is solid," Jasmine said, laying out a chart we'd created. "Richard's financial desperation goes back years. Gambling debts from 3 different casinos, total of $800,000 owed. Credit cards maxed out. His apartment is 2 months behind on rent." I added another document to the pile. Bank records show He was betting on basketball games, horse races, online poker. Lost over $1 million in the last 4 years alone. Dad kept bailing him out, I said. Every time Richard said he'd hit bottom, Dad would write another check. Victoria added her notes. Until Robert discovered the embezzlement. That's when the free money stopped. Richard had built a lifestyle on stealing from his brother, and suddenly the well was running so he accelerated his timeline, I said. Couldn't wait for a natural inheritance. Needed access to the estate immediately to cover his debts before the casinos sent enforcers. Tyler provided the final pieces. Phone records showing 37 calls between Richard and pharmaceutical suppliers. Security footage he'd obtained from his father's apartment building showing Richard practicing Robert's signature at his kitchen table. A stack of old documents visible on the counter. He started planning this at least 8 months ago, Tyler said quietly. I found the drafts of the fake will in his desk. Multiple versions with different language, trying to make it sound authentic. I contacted Detective Ray Warren, someone I'd worked with on 2 previous fraud cases. We met at the precinct, and I walked him through everything. The embezzlement, the forged will, the poisoning, the threats against Victoria's family. Every document backed up with evidence that would survive scrutiny in court. This is one of the most comprehensive case files I've ever seen come from outside law enforcement, Ray said, reviewing the materials. You've essentially done our job for us that I want an arrest warrant. Today, you'll get it. We have enough for murder 1, fraud, embezzlement, forgery. Richard Bennett isn't walking away from this. I pulled out one final document. The real will, the one Dad had filed with his attorney 3 months before his death. The one that left everything to me and established a community development trust in his name. When you arrest him, I want to be there, I said. Ray looked at me carefully. This is personal for you. Why Father deserves to see justice done. And Richard needs to know exactly who brought him down. What comes next will show you why you should never underestimate someone who's grieving. Because grief doesn't just break you. Sometimes it forges you into something stronger than you ever knew you. Could be 1 week after burying my father. I stood in his living room preparing to destroy the man who'd killed him. I'd called a family meeting at Dad's house, the same house where Richard had administered the final dose of poison that stopped his brother's heart. The living room filled slowly. Aunt Patricia arrived first, Dad's only sister, her face still swollen from crying. My cousins followed, along with 3 of Dad's business partners who'd asked to attend after hearing about disputes over the will. Tyler came in last, sitting apart from everyone, his eyes meeting mine briefly with an understanding no one else in that room shared. Richard arrived exactly on time, dressed in an expensive suit I knew he couldn't afford. He carried a leather briefcase and wore the expression of a man who believed he'd already won. He didn't know that Detective Ray Warren was parked outside, waiting for my signal. Thank you all for coming, Richard said, taking position at the front of the room like he owned it. I know this is difficult, but we need to address Robert's estate and move forward with probate. That's why we're here, I said calmly. To address Dad's estate. Richard pulled out the forged will, laying it on the coffee table with practiced solemnity. As executor, I've had this reviewed by my attorney. Everything is in order. Robert's wishes were clear. Tyler inherits the company and all properties, and I'll manage the transition as executor until Tyler is ready to take full control. How convenient, Aunt Patricia said quietly. Robert never mentioned any of this to me. He wanted it to be private until after his death. Richard's tone suggested hurt, like we were all being insensitive to Dad's final wishes. My brother knew what he wanted, and we need to honor that. I stood up, pulling my laptop from my bag. Before we move forward with probate, I'd like everyone to see something. Naomi, this isn't the time for dramatics, Richard said. Did I agree? This is a time for truth. I connected my laptop to Dad's television, the screen flickering to life. Everyone, I need to tell you something. For the past 7 years, while Dad taught me the real estate business, I was also building my own career. I'm a forensic accountant and licensed attorney. I specialize in estate fraud and financial crimes. The room went silent. Aunt Patricia's eyes widened. Dad's business partners exchanged glances. "That's nice, dear," Richard said with barely concealed condescension. "But this isn't about your hobbies. This is about Robert's legally executed will. Then let's talk about legal execution." I pulled up the side-by-side comparison on the screen. This is the will Richard presented at Dad's funeral. And this is the will Dad actually filed with his attorney 3 months ago. The differences were immediate and stark. Even people with no legal training could see the discrepancies. "Dad's real will leaves everything to me," I continued. "It establishes a community development trust in his name and specifically states that Richard, as his estranged brother, receives no inheritance." Richard's face reddened. "This is slander. You're bitter and you're lying." "I'm a licensed attorney presenting evidence." My voice stayed level, professional. "Let me show you why Richard's document is a forgery." That I zoomed in on the signature. Dad broke his wrist 12 years ago. It never healed correctly. His signature always had a distinctive tremor, especially on capital letters. This signature is too perfect, too smooth. It was traced from an old document that I advanced to the next slide. The notary seal shows Multnomah County, dated March 15th. Dad was in San Diego that entire week for a real estate conference. I have his flight records, hotel confirmation, and calendar showing multiple meetings. He was physically incapable of signing this document on that date. "You're just trying to steal your father's legacy," Richard said, but his voice had lost its confidence. The document lists Victoria Chin as a witness. Victoria disappeared 3 years ago after Richard framed her for theft. I looked directly at Richard, but she didn't disappear far enough. And she didn't run empty-handed. Richard's face went white. "This is ridiculous," he said, but he was already moving toward the door. "Sit down, Richard." My voice cut through the room. "We're not done. Not even close." Tyler stood up, his jaw set. "Let her finish, Dad. For once in your life, tell the truth." Richard looked at his son, and something passed between them. Understanding. Betrayal. The moment when a child realizes their parent is not who they believe them to be. Fine. Richard sat back down, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "Say whatever lies you've prepared. No one will believe you anyway. They'll believe the evidence," I said. "And there's so much more than just the forged will." I advanced to the next presentation slide. Bank statements, wire transfers, shell company formations. 5 years of financial crime laid out with the precision of someone who'd spent years learning to track exactly this kind of theft. "Richard has been embezzling from Dad's company for 5 years, I said. "He created fake property acquisitions, phantom LLCs, and fraudulent contractor agreements. $2.3 million stolen over 60 months. Gasps rippled through the room. Dad's business partners leaned forward, staring at the financial trail on screen. "That's a lie," Richard said, but his voice shook. "Victoria Chin discovered it 3 years ago. She compiled all the evidence and showed it to Dad." I pulled up Victoria's documentation, every transaction highlighted and annotated. Dad promised to handle it quietly, to give Richard one last chance to make it right. But Richard couldn't risk that. He'd built gambling debts of over $800,000. 3 different casinos, online poker sites, sports betting. He needed Dad's inheritance immediately, not eventually. "This is absurd," Richard said, standing up. "I'm not staying here to listen to this character assassination." "Sit down," Detective Warren said, walking into the room. He'd been standing in the hallway, listening to everything. "Mr. Bennett, you're not going anywhere." Richard froze, looking between the detective and me. "Dad started building a criminal case against Richard 6 months ago," I continued. "He was going to turn over all evidence to the authorities. Richard was facing prison time for fraud and embezzlement. So Richard eliminated the problem." "What are you talking about?" Aunt Patricia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad didn't die of natural causes." I pulled up the toxicology report, watching Richard's face cycle through denial, rage, and panic. He was poisoned. Over 6 months, Richard administered small doses of digoxin, a heart medication, mixed into Dad's food and supplements. The poison built up in his system until his heart failed. The medical examiner confirms digoxin levels were 3 times the fatal dose. The room erupted. Someone screamed. Dad's business partner knocked over his water glass. Aunt Patricia started crying. Tyler stood up, his face a mask of horror. You killed Uncle Robert? You actually killed him? Tyler, sit down. Richard snapped. You told me he wanted me to have the company. Tyler's voice broke. You showed me texts, arranged lunches, made me believe he finally saw something in me. It was all manipulation to make your forged will seem legitimate. I did it for us, Richard said, his composure finally cracking. For our family. Your uncle had everything. The company, the properties, the respect. I'm his brother. I deserved something. You deserved what you earned, I said quietly, which was nothing. He had no right to cut me off. Richard's voice rose to a shout. I helped him build that company. I was there in the beginning. Then he discovers some missing money, and suddenly I'm nothing? Suddenly I'm a criminal? I gave him everything. You stole from him, Detective Warren said, and then you murdered him. He was going to destroy me, send me to prison, ruin everything. Richard looked around the room, searching for sympathy he wouldn't find. What was I supposed to do? Let him take it all away? I'm his brother. Blood. That should mean something. It did mean something to Dad, I said. It meant he gave you chance after chance. Bailed you out 6 times that we know of. Covered your debts, your failures, your mistakes. And you thanked him by stealing millions and poisoning his vitamins. Richard lunged toward me, but Detective Warren stepped between us. Richard Bennett, Warren said, pulling out handcuffs. You're under arrest for the murder of Robert Bennett, embezzlement, fraud, and forgery. You have the right to remain silent. The handcuffs clicked around Richard's wrists with a sound that seemed to echo through the silent room. He struggled for a moment, then went still, the reality of his situation finally settling over him like a weight. This is wrong, he said, his voice hollow now. I'm his brother. Family. That should count for something. It did, I said. Right up until you killed him. Detective Warren read Richard his rights, while 2 uniformed officers who'd been waiting outside came in to escort him out. Richard tried one last time to catch Tyler's eye, but his son turned away, unable or unwilling to look at him. It should have been mine, Richard said as they led him toward the door. All of it. I'm his brother. I deserved it. You deserved exactly what you got, Aunt Patricia said, her voice sharp through her tears. Nothing, Richard was taken out, still protesting, still insisting on his right to Dad's estate. Victoria stepped into the room from where she'd been waiting with another detective. Several people gasped. Dad's business partners recognized her immediately. Victoria! Aunt Patricia breathed. We thought you'd stolen from Robert, that I discovered who was really stealing, Victoria said quietly. And I paid for that discovery with 3 years of my life. Tyler approached me, his face drained of color. Naomi, I'm sorry. I should have questioned it. Should have known something was wrong when Dad suddenly started paying attention to me. You were manipulated, I said. Richard's good at that. He manipulated Dad for years, took advantage of his generosity, his willingness to believe family deserved endless chances, that I should have been smarter. You chose truth when it mattered most. That's what counts. Point. One of Dad's business partners, Michael Chin, stood up. Naomi, I had no idea about your background. Forensic accounting and law. Dad knew. He respected that I wanted to build something on my own first, without the Bennett name opening doors. I looked around the room at the shocked faces. He taught me that success you earn yourself is worth more than anything handed to you. Richard never learned that lesson. What happens now? Aunt Patricia asked. Now Richard faces trial for first-degree murder. along with fraud and embezzlement charges, Detective Warren said. The evidence Ms. Bennett compiled is extensive. This will be a long process, but justice will be served. As people began to leave, processing what they'd witnessed, Tyler stopped at the door. Uncle Robert's real will, the one leaving everything to you. What are you going to do with it all? I looked around my father's house, the home he'd built with his own hands and his own vision. Exactly what Dad wanted. Build something that matters. Honor his legacy the right way. By earning it, Richard's trial lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution presented Victoria's flash drive, the forged will analysis, toxicology reports showing fatal digoxin levels, and pharmacy records proving Richard had obtained the medication using his deceased ex-wife's prescription information. The defense tried to argue circumstantial evidence, reasonable doubt, family disputes over money. None of it held up against the mountain of documentation I'd compiled. The jury deliberated for 4 hours, guilty on all charges. First-degree murder, fraud, embezzlement, forgery. The judge sentenced him to 25 years to life with no possibility of parole for the first 20 years. Richard would be 83 before he could even apply for release. He looked at me once as they led him away in chains. I held his gaze without flinching. He'd taken my father, stolen years I'd never get back, moments we'd never share. But he hadn't won. Justice had Dad's will went through probate without contest. The estate was valued at $15 million, including the company, properties in 3 states, investment portfolios, and the Lake Tahoe vacation home where we'd spent summers when I was growing up. Everything came to me, along with instructions to establish a community development trust in his name. Victoria's testimony during the trial officially cleared her of all suspicion. The district attorney issued a public statement acknowledging she'd been wrongly accused, that she'd been a whistleblower targeted by a criminal trying to cover his tracks. Her name, her reputation, everything Richard had tried to destroy was restored. That I offered her the position of CFO at Bennett Properties. She accepted with tears in her eyes. I can finally stop running, she said. I can bring my sister and her kids to visit. I can have a life again. Tyler struggled in the aftermath. Learning your father is a murderer doesn't come with a handbook. He started therapy, working through years of manipulation and emotional neglect. We met for coffee once a month, 2 cousins trying to figure out how to move forward when the past had imploded so completely. I keep thinking I should have seen it. He told me 3 months after the trial. All those texts, those lunches. I wanted so badly to matter to someone that I ignored every red flag. Richard was skilled at manipulation. He fooled Dad for years, stole millions right under his nose. You're not weak for believing someone who claimed to care about you. I'm going back to school, Tyler said. Environmental law, something that helps people instead of taking from them. I need to build something clean, you know. I know. The family dynamics shifted in unexpected ways. Aunt Patricia apologized for not questioning Richard's story more thoroughly, for assuming the forged will was legitimate. Some of Dad's business partners reached out, offering condolences and respect for how I'd handled the investigation. Others stayed silent, uncomfortable with the ugliness that had been exposed. A few relatives sided with Richard, sending me angry messages about tearing the family apart, about publicly humiliating a grieving brother. I blocked their numbers without responding. Some people will defend monsters rather than acknowledge uncomfortable truths. 6 months after Dad's death, I stood at his grave with fresh flowers and the business quarterly report showing record profits. Victoria had restructured our accounting systems, eliminating the vulnerabilities Richard had exploited. Tyler had enrolled at Lewis and Clark Law School, and I had finally stopped crying every time I thought about that last conversation with Dad, the one where he'd said he had something important to tell me. That I got him, Dad, I said to the granite headstone. He's not getting away with what he did to you, to Victoria, to all of us. He's going to die in prison, and your legacy is going to help hundreds of people build better lives. The wind rustled through the trees, and for just a moment I could almost hear his voice, That's my girl. Always knew you were stronger than anyone gave you credit. 4.3 months after the trial, I merged my forensic accounting practice with Dad's real estate company. The new entity, Bennett and Associates, focused on estate protection, fraud prevention, and real estate development with an emphasis on ethical business practices. The company Dad built had been solid, but I expanded it in ways that honored his values while incorporating my own expertise. We started offering fraud prevention consulting to other family businesses, teaching them how to protect themselves from the kind of theft Richard had committed. We developed training programs for accountants on recognizing embezzlement patterns. We became known as the firm that prioritized integrity over profit margins. I hired a diverse team, deliberately seeking out people who'd been overlooked or underestimated in their previous positions. People like Victoria, who had the skills but had been targeted by someone more powerful. People like Maya Johnson, a brilliant analyst who'd been passed over for promotions because she didn't fit the corporate image. People like David Reyes, whose creative approach to real estate development had been dismissed as too unconventional. We created a scholarship in Dad's name for first-generation college students pursuing business degrees. 5 full-ride scholarships every year to kids who were building something from nothing, just like Dad had. Just like I had, the grief didn't disappear. Some mornings, I still woke up reaching for my phone to text him about a new deal or a problem I needed his advice on. But purpose helped, turning his death into something that protected other families, that honored his legacy, gave the pain meaning that I visited his grave every Sunday, bringing coffee like we used to share in his office before meetings. I'd tell him about the business, about the scholarship recipients, about how Victoria's sister had moved to Portland with her kids, and they were finally safe. I'm doing what you taught me, I said on one of those visits. Building something that matters. Something that can't be taken away by people who think they're owed what others earned. The Bennett name meant something different now. Not just success or real estate development, but justice, integrity, protection for people who couldn't protect themselves. Dad would have been proud of that point 6 months after Richard's sentencing. My life had found a rhythm I never expected. Bennett and Associates was thriving, with 3 major contracts for fraud prevention consulting and 2 new real estate developments breaking ground. We'd hired 12 new employees and opened a satellite office in Seattle that Victoria's family had fully reunited. Her sister's kids called me Aunt Naomi now, showing up at the office after school to do homework in the conference room. Victoria had stopped looking over her shoulder, stopped flinching at unexpected noises. She was healing. Tyler graduated with honors from his first year of law school and called me with the news. I got an internship with the Northwest Environmental Law Center, he said, his voice bright with genuine excitement. Helping communities fight corporate pollution. It feels right, you know, like I'm finally doing something that matters. Dad would have liked that, I told him. Using law to protect people instead of exploiting them, I started guest lecturing at Portland State University's Business School, teaching a course on estate fraud and financial crimes. Students filled the lecture hall, eager to learn how to spot the warning signs I documented in Richard's case. The course became so popular they added a second section. Some family members reconciled with me. Others stayed bitter, convinced I'd destroyed Richard out of greed rather than justice. I made peace with that. You can't control what people choose to believe, especially when the truth makes them uncomfortable. What mattered was that I'd honored my father's memory. I'd protected his legacy. I'd turned grief into purpose and pain into protection for others who might face similar betrayals. That I had peace. Not the kind that comes from everyone's approval, but the kind that comes from knowing you did the right thing. Even when it cost you everything, they tried to steal everything from me. My father's life, his company, his legacy, the truth about who he was and what he'd built. Richard thought he could rewrite history with a forged signature and a poisoned vitamin bottle. He thought family loyalty would protect him, that blood would outweigh evidence. But truth doesn't stay buried. Not when someone's willing to dig for it. That if someone wrongs you, especially family, document everything. Trust your instincts when something feels off. That signature that looks too perfect. That story that doesn't quite add up. That person who suddenly shows interest after years of indifference. Pay attention. Your gut knows things your mind hasn't processed yet. You don't need permission to seek justice. You don't need approval to protect yourself or honor someone you loved. Use whatever skills you have, whatever knowledge you've built, whatever resources you can access. Build your case with precision and patience. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that truth always finds a way. Subscribe to Revenge with Alice for more stories about people who refuse to let injustice have the final word. Remember, the truth always has a witness. Sometimes that witness is you.